In February of 2023, a trail camera mounted on a fence post at the rear edge of a property in Haywood County, North Carolina, recorded two figures standing at the tree line where the yard meets the Pisgah National Forest boundary. The camera was still operating in color mode at 6:47 in the evening, the ambient light just enough for the color sensor to work. In the resulting image, pale amber eyes catch the sensor flash from under the hemlock branches. Two sets of them, one pair high and wide, set in a skull that clears the lower hemlock branches, and positioned at a height no black bear reaches, standing flat-footed, and no person reaches without a ladder. The second pair lower and closer to the ground, placed in a head that is smaller but built to the same unmistakable template as the first. The young one has a slight irregularity in its rear left gait, a weight shift in the stride, compensation for an old injury, the kind of detail that a field-trained eye learns to read in animals managing around joint damage. The man who owns that camera recognized the gait pattern the moment he pulled the card from the Browning and loaded it on his laptop. He had last seen it nearly 5 months earlier, in the Shining Rock Wilderness, on a day he still has not fully put down. Before we get into it, let me know where you're watching from and if you've had an encounter like this. The man we are calling Clay agreed to share this account under one condition. His real name does not appear here, and the identifying personal details that would narrow him down in a county where most people have known each other across 2 or 3 generations have been kept deliberately vague. He spent years doing mountain search and rescue work as a volunteer with Haywood County Emergency Management, alongside trail maintenance seasons on Pisgah National Forest volunteer crews. Both roles depend on a kind of credibility that does not rebuild easily once it breaks. He cannot afford to become the man who tells his SAR colleagues he found a Dogman on the Art Loeb Trail, carried it 3 miles off the mountain, and then had its parent show up at his fence line with the pup. The name is changed, the location is exact, the geography is precise, and the camera footage is exactly what he says it is. Haywood County sits in the far western corner of North Carolina, pressed against the Tennessee line to the north, and the Blue Ridge Parkway running east to west along its upper ridge. The county's seat, Waynesville, sits around 2,700 feet in a river valley, with mountains rising well above 5,000 feet within a few miles in every direction. The Pisgah National Forest covers most of Haywood County's higher ground, and within it, the Shining Rock Wilderness holds nearly 18,000 acres of the most rugged and least visited terrain in the region. Cold Mountain rises to 6,030 feet inside that wilderness. The Art Loeb Trail crosses it on a 20-plus mile backcountry route through high spruce fir forest, open ridgeline, and the dense rhododendron drainages the southern Appalachians are known for. Clay has been walking those drainages since before he was old enough to carry anything useful into them. He grew up in the Jonathan Creek community, north of Waynesville on US Highway 19. His father hunted deer and turkey and black bear in the Pisgah. Clay was in the mountains above the family property before he could read a topographic map, knowing the creeks by sound and the game trails by pattern. He joined the county's Mountain SAR volunteer program in his mid-20s and spent 2 decades running rescues through the Shining Rock Wilderness and every other drainage in the Pisgah. He knows that terrain in the way that emergency operations in long years create, not just where things are, but how they behave in the dark, in bad weather, in conditions that change fast at altitude. Before we go any further, make sure you subscribe to the channel. There is a lot more of this material, and I do not want you to miss it. He had been volunteering on Pisgah Trail maintenance for about 6 years by the fall of 2022. The Forest Service identifies sections that need work, coordinates the materials and tools at the trailhead, and volunteers sign up for specific sections on a schedule the district office manages. Clay had developed a specific competence in drainage work, the repair of natural water bars and constructed drainage features that wash out in heavy rain seasons and leave the trail tread exposed to progressive erosion. He knew which sections of the Art Loeb Trail were prone to drainage damage, and he generally picked those sections up on the maintenance schedule because he understood what they needed. It gave him a reason to be in the upper Shining Rock Wilderness in September every year, well past the summer hiking traffic, in the spruce fir quiet of the high-elevation trail after the season had run down. His property in the Jonathan Creek community sits on about 14 acres on a gravel road off State Route 1377, The house and a small barn occupy the cleared lower ground. Above them, the land climbs toward the National Forest boundary, which runs along a ridge at the back of the property. Behind that ridge, the Pisgah National Forest begins and runs uphill through dense second-growth forest for miles, no road and no structure between his fence line and the Art Loeb Trail, 4 or 5 miles as the crow flies. He put trail cameras on the rear fence after bears approached his beehives in the lower meadow. The Browning strike force on the rear fence post had been running for about a year by the time the events of the fall began. In that year it had caught deer, a large black bear working toward the meadow in August, raccoons on their regular circuit, and an eastern coyote that sat in front of the lens for 6 minutes one December night.
Quick thing before we move on, I have this book coming out. It's called the Dogman Codex. It's a compilation of all my research and findings. Been working on it for a long time. So if you want to check that out, links down below. Now let's get you back to the video.
Haywood County sits in the far western corner of North Carolina, pressed against the Tennessee state line to the north and the Blue Ridge Parkway running east to west along its upper edge. The county seat, Waynesville, sits at around 2,700 feet in a river valley, with mountains rising well over 5,000 feet within a few miles in every direction. It is a working community, not a resort. The local economy runs through small manufacturing, agriculture, a regional medical center, and the trades. The mountain tourism that has transformed parts of western North Carolina into something resembling a destination economy has touched Haywood County at the edges without changing its fundamental character. People here have been in the same hollows for 4 and 5 generations, and they carry that duration with them in the way that people do when staying on the land is the organizing decision of a family's history. The Pisgah National Forest covers the majority of Haywood County's higher ground. The Shining Rock Wilderness, a federally designated backcountry area of just under 18,000 acres within the Pisgah, holds the most rugged and least visited terrain in the county. This is high country by Eastern standards. Cold Mountain, at 6,030 feet, is the highest non-bald peak in the county and one of the higher summits in the southern Appalachians. The Shining Rock area takes its name from exposed outcroppings of white quartzite that catch the sun at certain angles and can be seen from miles away on clear days. The terrain in the wilderness is steep-sided and dense, the slopes covered in spruce fir above 5,500 feet, mixed hardwood at the lower elevations, and below the trails in the draws and drainages, the rhododendron and mountain laurel communities that the southern Appalachians are famous for. These are not casual shrubs. In the drainages below the Art Loeb Trail, the rhododendron grows 20 to 30 feet high, the trunks as thick as a man's forearm, the branches interlocking into walls that stop forward movement completely unless you know how to work through them low and slow. Local people call them laurel hells, and the name fits. The Art Loeb Trail is the primary backcountry route through the Shining Rock Wilderness, a 20-plus mile footpath that runs from the Daniel Boone Scout Camp in the east across Cold Mountain, through the Shining Rock Ledge, past Tennant Mountain, and eventually out to the Gloucester Gap trailhead near the Forest Service boundary to the west. It gains and loses elevation constantly, running along exposed ridgelines and then dropping into the drainages between them before climbing again. In mid-September, which is when the Pisgah National Forest's volunteer maintenance schedule typically puts crews on the upper sections, the trail runs through terrain that is starting its slow color shift from deep summer green into the early orange and red of the high-elevation hardwoods, changing first. The spruce stands on the ridges above 5,500 feet stay dark and dense regardless of season. The trail itself is narrow, single-track, packed earth and exposed root in the sections that see heavy use and loose rock and duff in the sections that do not. Clay grew up in the Jonathan Creek community, north of Waynesville on U.S. Highway 19, in a hollow where his family had farmed for 3 generations. Jonathan Creek runs along the valley floor there, cold and clear, before joining the Pigeon River downstream. The mountains rise steeply on either side of the valley, the National Forest boundary coming down the ridgelines behind the houses and the farms, the line between private land and federal land marked by old iron witness posts in the soil and boundary trees with painted blazes on their north faces. His father hunted white-tailed deer and wild turkey and black bear in the Pisgah, and Clay was in the woods above the house before he was old enough to carry anything more useful than a headlamp. He knew the trails behind his family's property by feel before he could read a topographic map. He knew the creeks by the sound they made in different seasons, the way the deer moved, the places where the laurel hells opened into small clearings that the old-timers had names for that did not appear on any Forest Service sign. He did 2 years at Western Carolina University in Cullowhee before money and circumstance brought him back to Haywood County in his early 20s. He joined the county's mountain search and rescue volunteer program at 24, doing basic technical rescue training and then progressively more advanced work in wilderness, emergency medicine, and high-angle operations. Over the following 2 decades, he ran rescues on the Art Loeb Trail, the Cold Mountain Approach, the Shining Rock Ledge area, the access routes through the Pisgah managed recreation areas. He pulled hikers off the trail in August heat exhaustion events and in November hypothermia situations. He did 2 extended searches for overdue solo hikers that lasted into night operations in winter conditions. He knows that wilderness in the way you know terrain after you have been tested by it across many years and in many different states of emergency, which is a different and more complete knowledge than recreational familiarity produces. Before we go any further, make sure you subscribe to the channel. There is a great deal more of this material, and I do not want you to miss it. He had been doing volunteer trail maintenance for the Forest Service for about 6 years by the fall of 2022. The way that program works is straightforward. The Pisgah National Forest identifies sections of trail that need attention, organizes the needed materials and tools at the trailhead, and volunteer crews or individual maintainers sign up for specific sections on a schedule the district office coordinates. You go in, you do the work, you document what you did and what you found, and you leave the section better than you found it. The work ranges from clearing blowdown and brushing encroaching vegetation to more involved drainage work and trail tread rehabilitation. Clay had developed a specific competence in the drainage work, the repair of natural water bars and constructed drainage features that wash out in heavy rain years and leave the trail tread exposed to progressive erosion if not addressed. He knew which sections of the Art Loeb Trail were prone to drainage problems after wet seasons, and he generally picked those sections up on the maintenance schedule because he knew what they needed. His property in the Jonathan Creek community sits on about 14 acres on a gravel road off State Route 1377. The house and a small barn occupy the cleared ground in the lower portion. Above them, the land climbs toward the National Forest boundary, which runs along a ridge at the back of the property. Behind that ridge, the Pisgah National Forest begins and runs uphill from there through dense second-growth forest for miles, with no road and no structure between his fence line and the Art Loeb Trail 4 or 5 miles as the crow flies. He has beehives in the lower meadow and had put up trail cameras on the fence at the rear of the property after bears began approaching the hives in the early mornings. The Browning Strike Force camera on the rear fence post had been running for about a year by the time the events of the fall began. In that year it had caught deer most evenings. A large black bear working toward the meadow in August, a family of raccoons that moved through on a predictable circuit, and an eastern coyote that sat in front of the lens for 6 minutes, one December night. The coyote footage was the most striking thing the camera had produced in its first year. Clay would revise that assessment. The encounter happened on the last Saturday of September, 2022. He drove out before first light to a trailhead off Forest Road 816, a gravel Forest Service road that comes off Highway 215 about 14 miles south of Canton. He had driven it many times. In the pre-dawn dark of a late September morning in Haywood County, the road climbs through second-growth timber that is still dense enough to block the sky on both sides, the headlights picking up the gravel surface, and the occasional deer standing at the road edge. The temperature was 41 degrees when he left his driveway at 5:30. By the time he parked at the Avester Gap trailhead area, it was 39. The sky was clear. The stars above the Shining Rock wilderness were the kind that appear at elevation in the southern Appalachians after a dry week, dense and close feeling in a way that they do not appear from the valley. He was doing a solo volunteer day on a section of the Art Loeb Trail that had taken drainage damage from a wet summer, specifically a section about 3 miles in from the trailhead, where a series of natural water bars had been undercut by runoff and were beginning to channel erosion down through the tread. He parked at 6:40, shouldered his pack with the tools and materials he needed, and was on the trail by 6:50. The first light was coming when he passed the 2-mile mark, the spruce canopy above the trail beginning to separate the sky into manageable pieces. He reached the damaged section by 9:30 and started in on the repair. It is harder work than it looks from the outside. At 5,500 feet in the southern Appalachians, the soil below the trail tread is a mix of clay and decayed organic matter over the quartzite substrate, and undercutting from water movement creates sections where the tread surface is essentially floating over a void. Repairing it means opening the cut edges, addressing the drainage flow, rebuilding the water bar with material that will redirect flow without eroding in the next event. Clay worked for about 2 hours. By 11:30, he had addressed the 3 worst sections and repacked his tools. He heard something in the drainage below the trail. The Art Loeb Trail in that section runs along the upper contour of a drainage that falls away sharply toward Flat Laurel Creek 200 feet below. The slope is covered in the dense second-growth spruce fir of the high Shining Rock wilderness, with rhododendron filling the draws and lower sections in the thick laurel hells that are characteristic of every wet drainage in the county. What Clay heard from below the trail did not match any category from 2+ decades of backcountry experience. Not a bear moving through rhododendron, which has a specific crashing sound driven by the animal's mass against the interlocked branches. Not a deer. Not any of the bird or small mammal sounds that the trail corridor produces in constant background through the warmer months. He stood with his Pulaski and listened for 30 seconds. The sound came again, something in distress, low, contained, irregular. He called out twice, identifying himself the way he would on a SAR call-out where an injured person might be sheltered below a trail in rough terrain. No response. He heard movement in the rhododendron below him, and then silence. He went over the edge. Entering a southern Appalachian laurel hell is not something you do casually. The rhododendron in a mature drainage thicket grows with its main trunks at angles that make upright movement impossible. You go in crouching, ducking under the main canopy of branches, working through a network of trunks as thick as fence posts going in every direction. The light drops immediately, 10 feet into a dense thicket, and you cannot see back to where you entered. The sound of the trail above disappears almost as quickly. It is close and dim, and the air inside a laurel hell on a cool September morning carries the smell of damp soil and leaf debris and the faintly medicinal quality of the rhododendron itself. Clay moved toward the sound of water below him, navigating by that and by the general sense of downslope, and pushed through the densest section until the thicket opened into a small drainage floor. A series of flat quartzite ledges stepped down toward the creek in the drainage floor, each one wet-edged and moss-covered. Under the lowest accessible ledge, where the rock overhung enough to create a shallow, dry shelter, something was lying on its side. His brain offered bear cub. Immediately, with the speed that pattern recognition fires from 2 decades of field experience in black bear country. The shape was dark, large, curled tight. The color was right. The context, a sheltered spot under a rock overhang in a Pisgah National Forest drainage, was consistent with what a separated bear cub does when it is exhausted and confused. He was coming in from above and from an angle, crouching under the rhododendron canopy still, and the shape below him was turned away, showing its back. He took 2 steps to the right to change his angle and see the head, and the proportions refused to hold the bear cub classification. The head was too large, not large in the way of a well-fed cub, but large in the way that suggested a different skull architecture entirely. The muzzle extended forward from the skull in a profile he could see even in the low light of the drainage floor, forward and projecting the way a canine skull is built rather than the broader, flatter profile of a bear. The ears, visible above the folded posture, were large, and where they showed their tips they were pointed. He could see the rear left leg extended at a wrong angle, pulled back from the body and turned outward at what should have been the ankle. The joint swollen to a visible thickness even in that light. He stood at the ledge and stayed still for 4 or 5 minutes. His search and rescue training does not leave much space for anything other than itself in a distress situation. There was something hurt below him. He had a first aid kit. He had the training. Those facts assembled themselves before anything else could intervene. What looked back at him when the figure turned its head was not a bear's face and was not a dog's face. The eyes were fully forward-facing, set in the skull the way a predator's eyes sit, and they tracked him with an attention that was not the flat, fearful response of prey species in distress. He has described the quality of that attention to me in every conversation we have had, and the word he comes back to each time is the same: aware. Not animal awareness in the categorical sense. Present, assessing, aware of him as a specific thing rather than a generic stimulus. It had known he was there for longer than he had been looking at it. He did not run. He has turned that decision over many times since, and the honest accounting of it is that his SAR training categorized the scene before the frightened part of his brain could catch up. An injured animal in distress, below his position. No aggression in the posture or the face looking back at him. His hands knew where the first aid kit was before he had consciously decided to reach for it. He sat at the ledge edge and stayed there for those 4 or 5 minutes, close enough to be present without being crowding. The figure watched him. He watched back. When he moved his hand toward his pack, it tracked the hand, but did not flinch away. When he held still, it held still too. He offered water first. He poured some into his cupped palm and extended it forward without moving closer. The animal, and he was still using that word as a working category rather than a classification, studied his hand for a moment before leaning forward and drinking. It drank carefully, deliberately, watching him over the edge of his palm the entire time. He got a better look at the leg in the time it held still for the water. The ankle joint was swollen roughly twice its normal diameter, with dried blood dark in the fur around the point of the injury. The fur itself was dense and coarse, very dark brown and uniformly colored across the torso and the upper limbs. He looked at the foot, visible below the injured joint, canid in its overall plan, 4 toes with short nails rather than claws, the pad structure recognizable, but wider than any wild dog or coyote he had handled. The toes were long and separately articulated in a way that the word toes covers only approximately. He looked at them for a long time and made himself look away. He took out the ace bandage from his first aid kit, the elastic bandage he always carried for human ankle and knee injuries on SAR callouts. He wrapped the joint below the knee, or what anatomically corresponded to a knee in a leg structure that was canine in some respects, and unlike any canid he had seen in others. The figure held mostly still through the wrapping. Once it shifted hard away from him, a defensive withdrawal that had enough force behind it to make clear how much strength was present even in a compromised state. He pulled his hands back and waited. They looked at each other for 10 seconds in the close air under the quartzite overhang. Then it settled again. He finished the wrap and tied it off. He helped it to its feet. He got his arm under the good side, the right side, and assisted the movement upright. It rose on 2 legs, with an ease that communicated without ambiguity that this was its natural posture, not adopted for the moment. How it stood, on its feet, with the injured leg raised slightly, it came to about 5 feet 8 or 9 inches. The chest was narrow in proportion to what he already understood the adult form would look like, the limbs proportionally longer than they would be fully grown. Young, the hands, and the word arrived in his mind naturally and he did not question it, hung at mid-thigh level with a reach that was longer in the arm than a human arm produces. They had 3 miles of the Art Loeb Trail between them and the Avester Gap trailhead. The descent took close to 3 hours. The pup managed the trail on 3 points. Injured leg held clear of the ground, moving with deliberateness on each step before committing weight to it. Clay stayed to its left, the good side, matched in pace, ready if it needed a reference point. He had strapped the Pulaski to his pack to keep his hands free. The pace was less than 2 miles an hour on the flat sections and slower on anything with loose rock or root exposure. He moved the way he moves when assisting an injured person on a technical carry, attentive and close without crowding. The trail below the damaged maintenance section drops through a series of switchbacks before leveling out along the upper contour of the drainage. In the switchback section, the pup managed the grade changes by stepping across to the outside edge of each turn and using the uphill slope as a partial brace for balance. Clay watched the adaptation and recognized what it was: problem solving, a real-time adjustment to terrain constraints. not the trained behavior of an animal that has learned a specific trick. The application of a solution to a new problem as it presented itself. About 45 minutes into the descent, the movement started on the slope above the trail. The ridge on the uphill side of the trail at that section carries dense spruce fir, the tree canopy tight enough, and the rhododendron understory thick enough below it that visibility into the slope is essentially zero from the trail. What Clay heard from up there was a branch breaking, heavy, the crack of significant weight on a live branch rather than a dead one falling, then movement through the understory, lateral displacement of brush traveling 20 or 30 feet before going still, then nothing. Then perhaps 100 yards further down the trail, the same pattern, a branch, movement in the brush, stillness. He told himself it was a deer spooked by their movement, paralleling the descent in the cover at a safe distance above the trail. He needed to believe that. He had a 3-mile carry to manage, and no bandwidth to spare for a secondary problem. He kept walking, kept pace with the pup beside him, kept his eyes on the trail surface and the pup's footfall and the next turn ahead. The sounds continued at intervals through most of the descent, never closer than 60 or 70 yards, never falling behind, maintaining roughly the same separation in the uphill cover for the entire length of the trail. They reached the Ivester Gap trailhead parking area at 2:15. Clay's truck was the only vehicle in the lot. He opened his tailgate. He was thinking about whether the pup could be loaded and transported to a release point further from the trail, and simultaneously working through how he would explain the contents of his truck bed to anyone who drove up while he was loading it. When the pup pulled away from him, the movement was sudden and had more strength behind it than anything it had shown during the descent. The injured leg was held clear and it moved on 3 points toward the young birch and alder at the eastern margin of the parking lot, covering the distance to the tree line faster than he had seen it move all afternoon. It reached the cover and went in and was gone without looking back at him. Clay stood next to his truck. He sat on the tailgate eventually. He does not know how long he sat there. He got in the cab and drove back down Forest Road 816. He did not stop in Canton. He drove straight to his property on the Jonathan Creek Road, parked in his driveway, and sat in the truck for a while before going inside. His wife Gail was in the kitchen. He told her the trail work had run long. He went to his office and sat at his desk and looked at the wall for a long time. He did not tell her what had happened on the mountain. Not that evening, not the week after, not for the months that followed. He sat at his desk and went through his phone, looking at the photographs he had taken with it. 6 images from the drainage floor, shot at different angles in the low light. 2 images from the trailhead lot, taken as quickly as he could before the light went completely. He examined each image carefully, the way he would examine any piece of field evidence from a SAR operation, looking for what the image contained rather than what he wanted it to contain. What the images contained was exactly what he had been standing next to for 3 hours on the Art Loeb Trail. The phone did not change that. Putting the phone down did not change it either. His field notebook had the GPS coordinates, and the measurements, and the notes on the wrap and the descent pace. He looked at those for a while. The numbers were what they were. He had recorded them in the same small waterproof book he used for SAR documentation, in the same careful hand he used for everything that needed to be accurate. There was something almost absurd about the tidiness of the documentation. The page looked like every other documentation page from every other field day he had run in 20-plus years. The contents were not like anything else he had ever written down. He went back to the Ivester Gap trailhead the next morning at first light. In the soft ground at the lot's eastern margin, where the gravel of the turnaround gave way to the damp soil at the base of the birch and alder stand, he found what he was looking for. Partial impressions in the compressed earth, long, canid structure tracks, wide across the ball of the foot, with a toe spread larger than any domestic dog or wolf track he had ever measured in 20-plus years of backcountry work. He photographed every impression with his phone and cast the 2 clearest in plaster from his SAR kit. He measured what he could measure and noted GPS coordinates in his small waterproof field notebook. Then he walked back up the trail, 40 yards east of the trail, in the dense spruce fir cover on the uphill side at the point where he had first heard the movement above him. He found where something had been moving parallel to the path. The duff was disturbed in the compressed, displaced pattern that heavy animal passage leaves in accumulated conifer needles, a directional line of disturbance that ran along the same general bearing as the trail below it. At the point where the terrain had pressed the cover close to the trail, he found a partial impression in soft soil at the base of an exposed spruce root. One print, canid structure, roughly 11 inches long. He stood in the spruce cover on the upper slope of the Artlobe Trail, with the plaster kit in his hands, and understood, with the specific clarity that comes when a body of evidence resolves into a single picture, that he had not been alone on that descent. Whatever had cracked that branch and moved through that brush and maintained 60 to 70 yards of separation for 3 miles of trail, it had been there from somewhere early in the descent, and the print in the soft soil said what it was. The months that followed were uncomfortable in ways Clay found difficult to name. He is a practical person who addresses problems and moves forward, but the Seneca Creek encounter did not respond to that approach because there was no constructive forward step available. He went through the institutional options and found what he expected. He thought about the 2 or 3 people he knew personally who had experience with biological anomalies in field reporting contexts. A retired state wildlife biologist he had worked with on a mountain lion sighting investigation in 2014, which turned out to be a legitimate large felid of uncertain origin that the Wildlife Resources Commission had eventually acknowledged and then declined to investigate further. A game warden he trusted completely, who had told him in a direct conversation that his unofficial opinion about and that the gap between those 2 things was a matter of professional survival rather than intellectual honesty. These were practical men, with practical reasons for the position they held publicly, and Clay understood the shape of the box they were in because he was in it himself now. The North Carolina Wildlife Resources Commission manages wildlife through a classification system covering black bear, white-tailed deer, eastern coyote, wild turkey, bobcat, red fox, gray fox, and the full list of regulated species. There is no column in that system for what he had found in the Flat Laurel Creek drainage. The Pisgah National Forest Ranger District Office in Pisgah Forest operates under the same fundamental biological framework. He had spent years doing paperwork for 2 organizations that together managed most of the land he worked, and he understood documentation well enough to know that the best documentation in the world is useless without a receiving category. What he had to report had no receiving category in any system he knew. He did not tell his SAR team. He had built a specific reputation over 2 decades. The person in the field whose assessment of a situation could be relied upon without qualification. The moment he reports an undocumented large bipedal canine in the Shining Rock Wilderness, he is no longer that person. The mechanism that replaces him is gentle and well-intentioned, and involves phrases like accumulated stress and the demands of long-term volunteer service. He could not afford that mechanism. He kept quiet. He kept running the cameras, weekly card checks on Sunday evenings, deer, the bear in October, raccoons on their circuit. Nothing unusual from the rear fence post camera. November became December. December became January. The card checks had a rhythm that was different from everything else in his week. The Sunday evening routine had been established before the events of September. He drove up through the property, parked at the barn, walked the path to the rear fence post in whatever light was left, pulled the Browning card, drove back down to the house, and reviewed it on his laptop at the kitchen table. Before September, that review took 5 minutes. He would scroll through the deer traffic and the occasional bear sign, and close the laptop and go back to whatever the evening held. After September, the review took as long as he needed it to take. He was looking for something specific without knowing whether he was going to find it, and the not knowing was a different kind of weight from any surveillance task he had run before. SAR surveillance has defined parameters. You are looking for one thing. The outcome is binary. What Clay was doing across those Sunday evenings did not fit any category from his training. He was looking for something that should not be there, that he had direct field evidence did exist, that he had no institutional language to report, even if he found it again. The Browning on the rear fence post triggered on February 14th, 2023. He ran through the card in his usual Sunday sequence. The first images were a doe and a yearling coming out of the hemlock gap at dusk, moving toward the creek. He scrolled forward. The next trigger was at 6:47 in the evening. The camera was still in color mode. The ambient light was just enough for the color sensor to operate. The image is grainy at this light level, the detail limited by the camera's range and the low light, but with more dimensional information than the infrared night shots provide. At the hemlock gap at the rear fence line, where the deer come through and where the bear had been approaching, there were two shapes. The first was large in a way that took Clay a moment to process against the reference points in the image. The hemlock branches behind the gap gave him scale, and what was standing at the gap cleared those branches at a height that no deer and no flat-footed bear produces. The head was visible above the lower branches. He looked at the head in the image for a long time. The forward projection of the muzzle, visible in profile. The ears above it. The second shape was behind and to the left of the first, partially screened by the larger figure and by a hemlock branch at the frame's left edge. Smaller, lower, looking at the larger figure with the lateral attention of a young animal tracking its parent in uncertain ground. Clay closed the laptop. He sat at the kitchen table for a while. Then he opened the laptop and looked at the images for another hour. He added a second Browning to the area within a week. This one mounted 8 feet up on a hemlock trunk at the corner of the fence line, aimed to cover the section of tree line. The fence post camera could not reach from its angle. He checked both cameras every 3 or 4 days. He told Gail he thought the bear was coming back toward the hives, and he was monitoring the back fence more closely. The two figures returned to the rear fence line 7 times between February and the end of May. Not every visit included both of them. On 5 of those visits, only the larger shape appeared, standing at the hemlock gap for periods ranging from several minutes to close to 30 minutes before retreating into the forest. Clay watched those visits with the same methodical attention he brought to tracking sign in the field. He cataloged the position, which was consistent across all 7 visits, always the same point on the fence line, the same gap in the hemlock. He cataloged the timing, consistently at dusk or in the early nighttime hours. He cataloged the posture, noting the angle of the head on each visit, whether it was oriented toward the camera, toward the house, or scanning laterally. 2 of the 7 visits included the smaller shape. In the first, it stayed completely screened in the tree line, visible only as a partial outline behind the larger figure. In the second, in late March, it came forward. That visit happened on an evening when both cameras were still operating in color mode at 6:52, the ambient light holding late in the spring. The larger shape was at the hemlock gap in its established position. In the color image, Clay could read the fur for the first time clearly. Very dark brown, nearly black in that light, dense and uniform across the torso and upper arms. The forward profile of the muzzle, the pale amber of the eyes catching the sensor. The smaller shape had moved forward from the tree line into the open ground between the hemlocks and the fence post. 6 feet forward, fully clear of the hemlock screen, fully in the camera's field without obstruction. It was standing upright, and it was looking at the camera, not at a sound near the camera, not at the fence post itself, at the lens, with the specific quality of attention Clay had seen under the quartzite ledge in September, the attention of something recognizing a specific object it had learned to identify. The pup had developed an understanding of what trail cameras were. It looked at the lens the way something looks at a thing it has been taught to recognize. Clay has 2 images from that visit. The burst function fired a second frame at roughly a 45-second interval. In the first frame, the pup is looking at the camera. In the second frame, it has turned slightly to look back at the larger figure at the tree line. After that, both cameras show empty ground. The remaining motion trigger that night was a deer at 11:40. If you have spent time anywhere in the Pisgah country, whether you are hunting the Haywood County ridges or hiking the Artlobe Trail or just driving the Blue Ridge Parkway past the Cold Mountain Overlook, I want to hear from you in the comments. Let me know what you have seen out there, because the accounts that have come out of the Shining Rock Wilderness and the broader Pisgah Highlands over the years tell a story that most people who drive through have no idea about. What Clay said about the March footage was plain and specific. He said it looked like the young one was being shown where it was, being shown this property, this camera, this fence line. He said it the way he reports a field observation, as what the record most directly described, without claiming more than the record could support. The consistency of that reading with what Linda Godfrey documented across 3 decades of Dogman research is not accidental. Godfrey built the most comprehensive case file on Dogman encounters in the research community, working from accounts collected across the Great Lakes region and the broader Midwest and into Appalachia and the South. The behavioral patterns she identified across hundreds of independent accounts hold stable across geography in ways that suggest the stability comes from something real. Nocturnal activity with selective daylight contact, association with specific drainages and water corridors, territorial behavior that defaults to warning over attack, and what she called deliberate visibility, encounters where the behavioral evidence strongly suggests the dogman is choosing to be seen, presenting itself to a specific person at a specific location rather than being caught in the open by accident. The behavioral documentation Godfrey assembled across her decades of research shows the same territorial consistency in the southern Appalachian accounts that it shows across the Great Lakes region. The accounts from the Nantahala National Forest and the Cherokee National Forest across the Tennessee line, accounts collected from hunters and foresters and rural families who had no knowledge of each other and no access to any common documentation framework, describe the same behavioral signatures. The particular relationship with specific drainages, the pattern of parallel observation rather than direct confrontation, the selective visibility that reads as deliberate presentation rather than accidental exposure. The accounts differ in regional particulars. They are consistent in what the animal does and how it moves, and what it seems to understand about the people who encounter it. That consistency across accounts collected from sources that could not have coordinated them is what the serious field researchers treat as the evidentiary core. The timing of the March visit, at the edge of usable daylight rather than in the deep of night, is consistent with that behavioral category. The selection of that specific light condition to bring the pup forward into the open, when the camera would capture color rather than infrared only, is consistent with a level of awareness of what the camera produces that reaches further than most people are willing to credit to a non-human animal. The Southern Appalachian Dogman record runs thinner in published documentation than the Great Lakes record, but it runs deep in the oral culture of the people who spend serious time in these mountains. Deer hunters and bear hunters who spend weeks in the Pisgah and the Nantahala and the Cherokee National Forest just over the Tennessee state line carry these accounts in the specific confidential register that hunting culture uses for things it cannot explain publicly. The audience for a Dogman account in rural Haywood County is limited to trusted people who know the woods, and the audience that would not receive it well includes enough people with professional relevance to make discretion the practical choice. These accounts have not been formalized into documentation, but what emerges from the oral record is consistent in its particulars with what the broader literature establishes. The Cherokee oral tradition gives this record a timeline measured in centuries rather than decades. The eastern band of Cherokee Indians has lived in the southern Appalachians since before any European explorer drew a map of the region, and their oral traditions contain a being known as Tsul'kalu', anglicized in various sources as Judicula, that appears in the academic literature on Cherokee oral tradition, with enough documentary depth to establish it as a serious historical record, rather than casual mythology. Ethnographer James Mooney, who collected Cherokee oral traditions directly from Eastern Band informants in the late 19th century, published accounts of Tsul'kalu' in his 1890 work, Myths of the Cherokee. Later ethnographer Franz Ulbrichts added further documentation in his 1932 Sacred Formulas of the Cherokee. Both bodies of work described Tsul'kalu' as a large being covered in coarse hair, associated with specific mountain territories in a way that carries the same meaning as ownership rather than presence. The high mountain wilderness of the Balsam Range and the surrounding highlands was Tsul'kalu's ground in the Cherokee traditional understanding, occupied in the same practical sense that a family occupies land it has held across generations, not in a European folkloric sense but in the direct sense of territorial claim, recognized and documented by the people who lived within it. Judicula Rock in Jackson County, North Carolina, is a real archaeological site with carved stone markings that Cherokee oral tradition connects to this figure. It has been documented. It has been studied. The connection is not invented. The Shining Rock Wilderness sits in the geographic center of what was Cherokee traditional territory in the western North Carolina mountains, before the treaties of the late 18th and early 19th centuries reduced those territories to the Qualla boundary southwest of Haywood County. These mountains, the Great Balsam Range, the Pisgah Ridge, the Black Mountains running to the north, were named and traveled and managed by Cherokee people for generations before the first English-speaking settlers came over the Blue Ridge. The knowledge that the Cherokee encoded about what lived in those mountains did not disappear with the land cessions. It went into the oral record of a community that still lives in these mountains and that still maintains traditional land management relationships with the high country. When the Eastern Band's Cultural and Natural Resources programs describe the mountain wilderness of western North Carolina in terms that do not reduce to the standard categories of Western wildlife management, they are drawing on a record of direct contact with that landscape that is centuries deeper than anything the Pisgah National Forest's management history can match. Steve Cook's 1987 radio broadcast in Traverse City, Michigan, established the modern public documentation framework for the Dogman phenomenon in a way that no previous effort had managed. The April Fool's broadcast was written from no prior knowledge of any sighting record. Cook invented the creature, and the response from real witnesses who recognized what the song described flooded in faster than the station could process. People who had been carrying their experiences in silence for years and decades, who had no framework for disclosure, found one in the broadcast. The case files that Godfrey assembled in the years following represent the first systematic public record of what appears to be a geographically widespread phenomenon that predated the documentation by a very long time. The Wexford County, Michigan account from 1887, describing two lumberjacks in the timber camps along the Manistee River who encountered a creature with a man's body and a dog's head, gives the modern record a historical depth that the 1980s broadcasts might otherwise obscure. The Cherokee documentation pushes that timeline back considerably further. If Tzulkalu traditions are encoding real encounters with a real animal, as the convergence of independent accounts across centuries and across cultural lines suggests they do, then what Clay found in the Flat Laurel Creek drainage in September of 2022 was not something new to those mountains. It was something the mountains had been holding since before the Cherokee arrived, that had a recognized and respected relationship with the Cherokee people documented in ethnographic literature that survived the logging of the late 19th and early 20th centuries that stripped the southern Appalachians to the ridgeline, and that is still there, in the drainages below the Art Loeb Trail, moving through the rhododendron in the way it has moved through those drainages since before anyone was drawing maps of this country. What happened to Clay's daily life between September of 2022 and the spring of 2023 was harder to quantify than the camera footage. He is a practical person who names things accurately and moves forward. But the Flat Laurel Creek encounter and the 4 months of camera evidence that followed it did not respond easily to that approach. He told Gail in late March of 2023, the week after the footage of the pup stepping forward, he had kept the September encounter from her for 6 months. Longer, if you count the weeks after the February footage, when he had the images on his laptop and chose to add a second camera rather than sit down with his wife and explain what he was watching. The 6 months had built a kind of distance that both of them noticed, and neither could name without the disclosure. She is a perceptive person, and she had watched the specific quality of his quietness accumulate after his mountain days, the way he came home and went to his office, rather than into the kitchen. She had not pushed it, but she had noticed it, and the noticing had changed the texture of a lot of evenings. He told her everything in order: the Flat Laurel Creek drainage, the quartzite ledge, the descent, the sounds from the slope above the trail, the plaster castings he had made and what the morning tracking had found, the February footage and what it showed, the subsequent visits and what they showed. He displayed the camera images on his laptop. She watched them twice and was quiet, and then she asked him the 3 questions she asks when she is establishing practical facts. Was any of it aggressive in any recorded interaction? Was there any indication of approach toward the house? Did he consider it an active threat to her safety on the property? He answered honestly. No aggression in 7 visits. Nothing that had approached closer than the rear fence line. Nothing that read as a threat based on everything the behavioral record contained. She said she wished he had told her sooner. He said the same. The 6-month silence had cost something that did not recover on a timeline either of them had control over. Not the damage of an open conflict, the subtler and more persistent damage of knowing that one person in a marriage has been carrying something significant that the other person could not reach. Once the disclosure came, the gap had to close from the other direction, which required the specific repair that Clay described to me simply as working at it over time. They are better now than they were in the spring of 2023. And he offered that without being asked. He stopped hunting. Clay had hunted white-tailed deer in Haywood County every October and November for more than 3 decades, starting in his early teens with his father on the ridges above Jonathan Creek. The deer season in the southern Appalachians is not a recreational activity in the cultural context of rural Haywood County. It is how families stay connected to the land, how men of Clay's generation mark the year, how the social bonds of people who work the mountains hold together across the months when other activities scatter. He did not buy a license in the fall of 2022. He did not buy one in 2023. The stopping of the hunting is the detail Clay returns to most often when he talks about what changed, not the silence he maintained with Gail, not the institutional dead end, not the SAR work carrying forward with its layer of additional awareness underneath. The hunting was the thing he had done every October and November without break since his early teens. The activity that organized the calendar and the social bonds and the connection to his father's way of being on this land. He had not been able to say with any precision why he stopped. He had tried. The honest accounting he arrived at was something like this. He had assisted an animal that was injured and frightened and alone in the mountains, and the animal's parent had observed every choice he made while doing it, and judged those choices accurately enough to bring the young one to his fence line for 7 visits across 4 months. The hunting stopped because the mountains had become a different place than they were before September of 2022, and the kind of relationship with what lived in them that the descent and the camera record described did not fit with also going out to the ridges every fall with a rifle. Holt, who has been his closest friend and SAR partner for close to 20 years, asked him about it once. Clay told him his knees had been giving him trouble and he was taking a season off. Holt knows Clay's knees. He has watched them manage technical mountain terrain on night rescues for 2 decades without stopping anything, and he heard the answer and let it go. But Clay told me the specific way Holt let it go, the careful kindness of a person who recognizes that an answer is not complete and chooses not to press, was itself a kind of measure of what the silence was costing. Holt noticed. He did not say so. That is how those things work between people who have been partners in difficult situations for long enough to understand each other's edges. The SAR volunteer work continues. Clay goes on call-outs when the Haywood County team needs him, including call-outs that take him into the Shining Rock Wilderness, including 2 in the 18 months since September of 2022 that brought him to within a mile of the flat Laurel Creek drainage. He does his job. He performs as he always has. He moves through that terrain now with a layer of awareness underneath everything else, an understanding of what the drainages below the Art Loeb Trail hold that has not changed the surface behavior of his fieldwork and has changed everything that runs underneath it. He has not been back to the quartzite ledge. The institutional silence around what Clay has documented does not require a conspiracy to function. The North Carolina Wildlife Resources Commission has a wildlife management framework built around a specific species list. There is no field in that system for what he found below the Art Loeb Trail. The Pisgah National Forest Ranger District Office in Pisgah Forest operates under the same biological architecture, even if Clay submitted his full evidence package. The plaster castings, the track photographs, the GPS documented locations, the trail camera footage from 7 visits across 4 months. Every piece of documentation would land on a desk without a classification that allows the receiving system to do anything with it. The person at that desk would face a choice whose outcomes are professionally asymmetrical. Filing the documentation as received requires acknowledging that the documentation exists as documentation of something. Not filing it requires nothing. That is not suppression. It is the simple operation of professional self-preservation in a system that was not built to handle the category. What Clay returned to across every conversation we had is the behavioral analysis of the descent from the Art Loeb Trail. The 3 miles of trail between the flat Laurel Creek drainage and the Ivester Gap trailhead. This is the element at the center of the case that does not resolve into anything simple. He had the pup. He was moving slowly toward the trailhead, at less than 2 miles per hour, on a maintained trail with the pup beside him. The parent had been on the uphill slope from somewhere early in the carry, possibly from the drainage itself. The track evidence the next morning could not establish exactly when the parallel movement began. What the evidence established was that the parallel movement was sustained over the full length of the descent, directional, and did not close toward the trail at any point. A large adult dogman in the Shining Rock wilderness, on a ridge it knew, with an injured young one moving slowly below it on a maintained trail, had choices that it did not exercise. It could have come to the trail at any of the dozens of gaps in the rhododendron, where the cover thinned and the slope was accessible. It could have intercepted at any point during 3 miles of slow movement. Instead, it maintained 60 to 70 yards of separation for close to 3 hours. Observed what Clay was doing, tracked the outcome of every exchange between Clay and the pup, and confirmed the release at the parking lot's edge before withdrawing. That behavioral record describes a parent making a continuous assessment of a human carrying its injured young across close to 3 hours of direct observation, and concluding through that observation that the human meant no harm. The conclusion was not assumed. It was reached through sustained watching of what Clay actually did on the trail, and the watching was deliberate from beginning to end. This is the frame through which the 7 visits to the rear fence line between February and May of 2023 make the most sense. The parent found Clay's property specifically, a gravel road 4 miles from the Ivester Gap trailhead, a fence line at the edge of the Pisgah National Forest, a trail camera on a fence post. It found it through the same systematic observation it had applied to the descent from the mountain. And when it came to the fence line, it brought the pup. The March footage, the pup stepping forward into the open in the last of the color light and looking directly at the camera lens, is the piece that Clay comes back to most often when he talks about what the full record means. He describes what it looked like with care. The parent at the tree line, the pup forward in the open, the pup looking at the lens, the pup turning to look at the parent, and then both of them gone. He says what it looked like was the pup being shown where it was, shown this fence line, this property, this human presence. He distinguishes between what the behavioral record shows and what it most directly implies, and he does not claim more than the record can support. But he does not pretend the record is ambiguous about what it looks like. The evidence is in a box in Clay's garage and on a hard drive on his desk. Plaster castings from the Ivester Gap lot margin, track photographs with GPS locations, field notes from the morning after the descent, with the single 11-inch print in soft soil documented at the base of the spruce root, trail camera footage from 7 visits across 4 months. He keeps it without entirely knowing what obligation he is keeping it for, except that keeping it seems like the only acknowledgement available to him for what the evidence describes. The Shining Rock wilderness is still out there. The Artless Trail is still maintained, section by section, by the Forest Service volunteer crews that Clay works with. The flat Laurel Creek drainage is still running below the trail. The laurel hells still dense in the draws. The quartzite ledges still stepping down through the drainage floor toward the creek. Whoever is in those drainages has been in them since before the Pisgah National Forest was established, since before the logging of the late 19th century that took the biggest timber off these ridges, since before the Cherokee were encoding Tsul'kalu's territorial claim on this mountain country, in a tradition that ethnographers would eventually document and researchers would eventually read, and that still describes something real about what those mountains contain. Clay checks his cameras every few days. Deer on the rear fence post, the bear on its late summer circuit toward the orchard, the raccoons on their schedule. The hemlock gap at the rear fence line shows empty ground in the infrared from night to night, the forest behind it dark and still. Some evenings he stands on the back porch before going in. He does not look for anything specific. He looks at the fence line where his property ends and the national forest begins. At the hemlock gap where 2 sets of pale amber eyes appeared in a color mode camera image on a February evening, at the dark wall of the Pisgah forest, rising from his fence line toward the Shining Rock wilderness and the Art Lobe Trail and the drainages that drop from the trail toward Cold Mountain on the far side. He looks at all of that and goes inside. The camera keeps running. Whatever is in the rhododendron thickets below the Art Loeb Trail keeps moving through them in the way it has moved through those mountains for longer than anyone has been keeping records of what moves there. It does not need to be classified by any agency. It does not need to appear on any wildlife management form. It was there before the Pisgah National Forest was established in 1916, before the cradle of forestry was built at Vanderbilt's Biltmore Estate in 1898, before the first settler family came over the Blue Ridge and found these mountain valleys and named them and put fence lines in them. It will be there when the fence lines come down, and the camera on the post will keep running until then, in the dark, at the edge of what Clay's property ends, and the mountains begin, recording what passes through the hemlock gap in the night without judgment or classification, or the need for anyone to tell it what it is looking at.